Right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. If you just bear with me, I'll just start sharing the screen. I'm going to run through a brief presentation prior to opening up the toolkit and working through it in more detail. So just bear with me whilst I open up the presentation and start sharing that. So hopefully people can now see what's on my screen. Which is the title slide for this afternoon, which is about republishing or updating your DSPT. And I'm quite happy to look at it from several different perspectives. So whether you're updating your DSPT from approaching standards, whether you're republishing your DSPT, or whether you're amending entries that might have been previously put into the DSPT. And I thought it might be worth just mentioning that I do recognise that some of you may not have seen the DSPT before, largely because of staff changes, i.e. the people that completed it previously may have moved on, and when you log in to republish or to update the DSPT, it may be the first time you've actually seen it. So I'm happy to work with any questions or any thoughts around any of that particular scenario. And so as I said, what I will be doing is running through a brief presentation covering some of the key points. Then I plan to log into the DSPT and work through what it looks like when you republish and how to work with it, etc. But it is a flexible session, so please do feel free to chip in to ask questions as we go through. And I suppose that the logical starting point is just to ask whether anyone's unsure what the DSPT is and wants me just to cover a brief overview in terms of what it's all about and why we're asking people to do it. Is there anyone who would require that? Are you quite happy for me to kick into the session per se? No one's come back to me, so I'm assuming you all know what DSPT is, and it is literally a question of republishing.
There's nothing in chat, so I'm assuming.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Okay, so working at it from the starting point that you have published the DSPT, or someone has published the DSPT previously. So at that point, whoever has published will get a confirmation of the fact that it's published by email and also on screen. And one of the key things to mention about republishing is that the next time you log on, the DSPT will look different. So when you publish for the first time, assuming you've selected social care when you set the organisation profile, you will get the social care view for the DSPT. And the social care view has been developed specifically for social care, and the only questions within the social care view are the questions that relate to a social care environment. When you log on the next time, it will look different. And I'll explain more about that as we go on. So the first time you complete DSPT, we tell you to complete all of the questions and ignore mandatory comments next to the questions. When you log on to republish or to amend the DSPT, you only need to answer the mandatory questions. And therefore you can ignore questions that haven't got mandatory next to them. So there's a difference in terms of the social care view, where the mandatory questions you ignore. When you republish the DSPT, you only answer the mandatory questions. So, and then the other key point is that it is a requirement with the DSPT that if you wish to remain compliant, that you do review your answers and publish it annually. And that's probably what's prompted most of you to be here this afternoon. So when you publish, you get your confirmation email from NHS Digital. An example is here on the screen. So it thanks you for publishing, and it tells you the date that you've published and the year that it's published for. There's a bit of blurb there about what the DSPT is about, that it's about ensuring that people can trust your organization, that personal confidential data is protected and used appropriately, and that the DSPT, one of the purposes of the DSPT is to provide assurances that your organization practices good data security and that all personal information is appropriately handled.
Alan, can I interrupt for one moment? I'm very sorry. We have one provider who is saying they'll be publishing for the first time. So just that you are aware.
Ah, right. Okay. Yep. Yes. So when you do publish, you will get this email from NHS Digital, and it will confirm on screen that you have published. And now one of the changes with the DSPT is that when you publish, you can download a certificate. So there will be a link when you've published to say download certificate that confirms that you have published to standards met, etc. And again, I thought it might just be worth mentioning that your DSPT toolkit status is available publicly, so that service users, commissioners, partner organizations, and the public can check on the DSPT website what your current status is. And increasingly, we're hearing that commissioners, partner organizations such as GPs, etc., are checking where you're at with the DSPT, because they're aware that in order to use things like NHS Mail, you have to be compliant with the DSPT. And increasingly, CQC are gaining awareness of the importance of the DSPT publication, etc. So I thought it might be worth a quick look at what that looks like. So if you go to the DSPT nhs.uk/organisation search, you can type in your ODS code, and the ODS code I've selected here is VLYTF, which hopefully we'll see belongs to Sunnyside Residential Home. So if someone does a search on your particular organisation, either by the ODS code or the address, you can see that it gives the details of the service. It will also give the publication history. So when you published and the frequency of publication. So you can see that this particular Sunnyside home is compliant and published on the 12th of April 2023, previously publishing in June 22 and June 21.
Alan, so, I don't know about the others, but I can't see that.
You can't see that?
No.
Okay, sorry. Just bear with me then. I'm not sure why you can't see that. But I'll come out of that and go back to
Can everybody else see that, or is it just me who can't see it?
No, I can't see.
Okay.
Bear with me. As you can see, I'm having some issues with my computer today. Is that better? Can people see that one now?
Yes.
Right, okay. So what we've got is, this is what people will see if they search on the DSPT toolkit for your entry. And you can see that this particular care home was published over the 3 years, as I mentioned earlier, and the date was published. And that's all people can see on the public website. They can't see what you've put in the toolkit, and no one else can see what you've put in the toolkit apart from yourself. So just a reminder that it is a self-assessment in terms of the toolkit. So once you've published, that's what people can see. And this is the screen capture of the confirmation of publication when you've published. So it says that your assessment has been published, etc. And nowadays it will show you the link through that I said to the certificate. Right, so how do you actually republish? What do you need to do? Well, if you can't remember what the link is for the DSPT, or you wish to use a search engine to find it, if you just Google DSPT, it will come up with the link to log in, which will look like this. So it's the Data Security and Protection Toolkit, and you can see on the top right hand side there it's got register or login. So the register button is what you would use if it's the first time you're completing. Login is what you use every subsequent time in order to look at the toolkit. If you've forgotten the password or you've got login issues, you can see that on this particular screen, if you remember the email, or you know the email that was used to complete the DSPT the first time, there is the forgotten your password link, as often is on login pages. So if you've got the email, you can simply click on forgot your password and it will allow you to reset the password. If when you go to republish you don't know or you can't remember the email address or the password, then you can contact the help desk, and in red on the right hand side of the screen there you can see that there is the contact details. So you ring 0300 303 4034 or email the Exeter help desk there. An important point is, if you can't get in, please provide your ODS code or the address so that they can link that through to the service that has published. And bear in mind that they do try to respond as quickly as possible, but it can take them up to 5 days to respond. And they request that you wait for the 5 days before you escalate to a major query. So if you do remember your password and you do know the email address that you've got to use, simply log in as per usual. And you will see what's on the left-hand side of the screen there. And you'll see that it's a slightly different screen layout to the first time you've done it, or the social care view. And it tells you when you need to complete your assessment for, the time frame. So this is for 22-23. And it makes the point that the assessment is linked to the Data Security and Protection Standards for Health and Care. So that's the National Data Guardians standards that we're referring there. And therefore, the toolkit has been written to map to the 10 National Data Guardians data security standards. Within the toolkit, there are the same 43 questions from the social care assessment view. And hopefully you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there that some of them have mandatory next to them and some of them don't. And just a reminder that all you need to do is complete the mandatory questions. One of the things that's different here is that on the top of the screen, you will see that it actually has a completion bar, and it will tell you how many of the questions have been provided, etc. Now, that may not be at 42, even though you published at standards met previously. The reason for that is that sometimes the wording of a question changes, or sometimes there is an additional question or a question that's been removed during the time frame between when you first published and when you're going back to republish. So always check to see whether it says completed next to the question, to identify the questions that may not have transferred across to this particular view, and that will be why the progress bar may not be at 42. Once you get into the questions, if you're completing a headquarters assessment, so you're using the HQ code, when you log in, it will say headquarters assessment, and you can see I've put an arrow pointing to where you can identify the branches or the other locations that are linked to this particular assessment, or that you want to link to this particular assessment. And it will say view branches, and you can tick the ones that you wish to be included within your particular assessment. So just a reminder, when you're republishing, only answer the questions marked mandatory. All other questions you can leave blank. You can complete them if you wish to, but it won't alter the status of your publication. The mandatory questions are the ones that have transferred across from the social care view. Again, a reminder that you only need to publish once a year, but it's really important that if things change in the organisation or you've added new services, particularly where you might be moving to, for example, digital social care records, etc., it's worth revisiting throughout the year. You don't have to just look at it once a year. In order to keep it up to date, you can revisit it anytime you like. So I think what we'll do now is go to a live demo in terms of the toolkit and just see where you want to go with that. So before I do that, are there any questions so far? Is everyone happy with what we've looked at? Anyone want to talk to me?
There's nothing in chat.
Okay, so let's go and log on to the Data Security Protection Toolkit. So we can see that on the top right-hand side here, there is the login and registration button that I referred to in the presentation. So if I press on login, it'll take you to the screen that I showed you just now. So password, email. Oh, just one point about logging in with NHS Mail. That is an option, but once you log in with NHS Mail, you will always have to log in with NHS Mail. So personally, I would recommend using a different email for your DSPT rather than logging in with NHS Mail, unless you're confident that you'll always be using the same NHS Mail account. Now, I mentioned about headquarter assessment just now. You can see that where I've logged in, I've actually got access to a number of DSPTs. And that would be the same for you if you were acting as administrator for more than one service and that they were registered separately. However, for the purposes of today, I'll select the Republish toolkit, and this is what you'll see when you log in. So, as you saw on the slide presentation just now, complete your assessment for 22-23. The reference to the National Data Guardian standards, the progress bar across the top. It gives you the option to view previous publications, and it gives you the option to download your assessment, should you wish to do so. And then we can see that it comprises the usual 4 sections, so staffing and roles, policies and procedures, data security, and IT systems and devices. So pretty much what you had in the social care view. But as I said, what's different now is there are some additional questions. And sorry to keep going on about it, but you only need to respond to the ones marked mandatory. So what it's asking is exactly the same as when you first published your DSPT, in exactly the same format. So you click on the question, it opens the evidence item. And there's the heading, who's got responsibility for data security and protection? How has this responsibility been formally assigned? And so it's asking here, who carries the can for your data security and protection within the organization? And what it's asking for here is a name and where that actually is specified. So whether it's in their job description, within the role description, wherever, whether it's in your policy and procedure, wherever it states who is taking a lead for data security and protection, and where that is stated. So you'd simply type that in, then click on Save, remembering, of course, that exactly the same as with the social care view, to type in the text box, not the comments box, because the toolkit won't recognize anything that's in the comments box. That's entirely for your use. So once you're satisfied with your response, you click on Save, and it would show it as completed against the question. Whilst we're in this question, I thought it might be worth just mentioning the various roles that you will have identified or not in your profile of the organisation. So it would have asked you who your senior information risk officer was. It would have asked you who your data protection officer is, who your Caldecott guardian is, and who your information governance lead is. In most circumstances, for a social care organisation, you don't need a senior information risk officer, and you're not required by law to have a data protection officer. You obviously will require an information governance lead, the person that is carrying the can that I referred to. But I just wanted to mention Caldecott Guardian, because it's one of the changes you will need to make if you're publishing your toolkit response after the end of June. Because from the 30th of June, you should have a Caldecott Guardian or access to a Caldecott Guardian. There has been a period of grace where social care has been given the option to have a Caldecott Guardian, but the guidance states that you should have one in place by the 30th of June. And so you may well have in your profile not specified a Caldecott Guardian. When you republish, I would suggest you go back into your profile and look at specifying what your Caldecott Guardian arrangements might be. Okay, so exactly the same process as when you first publish. You work through each of the questions in exactly the same way. So the first one was a text box. This one is a tick box. So simply all you need to do, if your response to the question is positive, is tick the box. So if you have an induction process that covers data security and protection, cyber security, then you can simply tick the box and then click on Save. So exactly the same process as you followed the first time you published. If you need to go into the questions at all, because if it states completed next to it, you may not need to. If nothing has changed, everything is as is, and all of the questions have got completed next to them, all you would need to do is to stroll to the bottom and publish your assessment. Okay, so again, I'm just going to stop sharing there for a moment. As I say, the process is exactly the same as the first time you publish, but is there anything anyone wants me specifically to cover? Is there anything that you're not sure of, or any of the questions that are causing you a problem?
Hi, Alan.
Hi, Simon.
The Caldecott Guardians. We're a charity, BHT Sussex. We don't have that requirement. So is that okay, or does that cause an issue going forward?
Right. In terms of whether or not you require a Caldecott Guardian, if you provide services to a public authority such as the local authority or to the health service, then you should be either appointing or making arrangements to have access to a Caldecott Guardian. But if you don't provide services that are publicly funded, then the guidance doesn't apply to you.
Okay, we do provide services.
Right. Okay.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. that's a requirement. Thank you.
Right. Well, it was originally made a requirement a couple of years ago, but because of the pandemic, it was postponed and they put the date off to the 30th of June. And they haven't really publicised it very much. And the other confusing thing is it says that if you wish to, as an organisation, you can decide that you don't want a Caldecott Guardian, but you have to justify that. So I would suggest that you read the guidance on the Caldecott Guardian and make a judgment yourself in terms of how it would best work for you.
Thank you.
Clear as mud, as it's all government guidance in terms of these things. Anything else from anyone, or shall I go back to the toolkit and just have a quick work through in terms of the questions and what they're asking?
I can't see any questions in chat. There was
Okay.
one, but I answered that. So perhaps if you go back in the toolkit and maybe just concentrate on the harder questions, the ones that you know may give people a little bit of a headache sometimes.
Indeed. Right.
Thank you.
Just bear with me.
Thank you, Alan.
Okay, so staffing and roles in terms of the harder questions. Induction process, I would assume that if you completed the toolkit previously, then you've already reviewed whether your induction process covers data security and cyber protection, etc. Employment contracts, volunteer agreements containing data security requirements. I'm assuming again that most organizations have got that covered. Training needs analysis covering data security and protection. I will just touch on that because it does state within the last 12 months, and that's a slight change, or maybe a slight change from when you last looked at it. In this particular question, it used to have a date from when you last completed your training needs analysis. Now they've recognised the fact that people are completing the toolkit at different timeframes. Therefore, it's only asking you to complete a training needs analysis once a year, whenever that might be. And there is an example training needs analysis available currently from Digital Social Care, should you wish to take advantage of that. But really all it's asking is, do you know who's had training in the last year around these themes? And who still needs it, and that you've got a plan for actually ensuring that everyone receives training during that 12-month period. So the first question is about induction. So does every member of staff get training on data security and protection and cyber security when they join? And then are there annual refreshers? So as part of your annual updates for all staff, are those topics included? Once you're happy that that is the case, again, tick the box and click on save. And then you'll see it's got completed next to that question, once you click on save. Next mandatory question, 95% of staff. So whilst you're carrying out your training needs analysis, identify the percentage that have been trained, etc. And if 95% have had training in the last 12 months, you're able to respond positively, and same process again, click on save. The next question is not mandatory, so I'll ignore that one. Provide details of any specialist data security. So they're not asking you to provide any specialist training, but they are asking you whether people with the responsibility for data security and protection have received appropriate training. So really what they're talking about here is that all staff have to have a baseline level of training and refresher around these themes. But for those with specific roles, so if you do have, so your information governance lead, and if you've got a Caldecott Guardian, for example, have they had the appropriate training to be able to fill that role appropriately? And again, it's a tick box question, so it's not asking you to prove or demonstrate that, it's asking you to ask yourself whether you're happy that the appropriate people have got the appropriate level of understanding and training. This question I will touch on because it always makes me laugh. Does your organisation have an up-to-date record of staff and volunteers if you have them in their roles? So do you know who works for you and what they do? I've yet to come across a provider who says no to that question, so I won't go into it in any more detail. Then we're moving into policies and procedures. Information Commissioner's registration number. So presumably you're all aware that you should be registered with the ICO if you're handling personal confidential information. Exceptions may be some charities. So the guy who just asked me about Caldecott Guardian, if you're a charity, it may be worth checking whether you're required to be registered with the ICO. And there is a tool on the ICO office, the ICO's website, that allows you to check whether or not you should be registered. If you're not required to be registered with the ICO, then it's perfectly acceptable to put not applicable in the text box. However, you shouldn't be doing that if you are required to be registered. One of the trickier questions is this one here, which is asking about your information asset register and your record of processing activities. So as a requirement under UK-GDPR, all organisations that hold and process personal and confidential information are required to have a list of the types of personal data that they have, where they keep it, and who they share it with. And that also requires you to identify the legal basis upon which you are holding and sharing that information. So whether that's consent, whether it's legitimate interests, or whether it could be one of the other requirements. So your information asset register should list all personal and confidential information that you hold and process. And the record of processing activities should list what you do with that data. So who you share it with, why you've got it, etc. And that includes all personal and confidential information. And it also includes any sensitive information that you might process, where you might need to give an additional legal requirement for that information. So you should all have some form of record of the personal and confidential information you've got and what you do with it. This question gives you the option to either upload that document, reference it where it might already be uploaded, specify a link to the document, or I would suggest that the easiest option is to click on the bottom link here, which opens a text box, and then you can just type its location rather than having to upload it, etc. And it does give you the option to choose a different method for specifying the evidence there. So once you've decided what the best response for your organisation is, you can click on Save, and that will be completed. Privacy notices. You will all be aware that privacy notice should be given or made available to all people that you hold personal and confidential information on, which specifies what information you hold, why you hold it, and what you're going to do with it, and when you'll get rid of it in terms of your retention schedule, etc. The next question, 116, is not mandatory again, so you don't need to respond to that. Another addition to the toolkit, so one of the questions that may not be pre-completed when you log in is whether or not you're compliant with the National Data Opt-out. The requirement for National Data Opt-out came in about a year ago. And if you haven't already responded to that requirement, then what you would need to do is to specify within your contracts and your policy and procedure, etc., what your response to national data opt-out is. So if you share information for the purposes of research, etc., you are required to look at the database that, where people who have opted out are listed, and not to share their information. If you don't share information for the purposes of research, then you can just put a clause within your policy and your contracts, etc., stating that's the case, but indicating that you are aware of the national data opt-out.
I've just popped in the chat. If anybody wants a sample policy sent to you, then I can do that, no problem.
Lovely, thanks, Nada. Yeah, but hopefully you're all aware of that and that you've all taken the appropriate action. So it will be a simple case of just ticking the box on the top left and clicking on save. Does your organization have up-to-date policies in place for data protection and cybersecurity? I'm fairly certain you will have, because NADA's been badgering you about that for the last couple of years. Does your organization monitor your own compliance with data compliance and data protection policies? So this is about your audit processes. Do you complete an audit of all of these things in order to be able to respond to the DSPT, apart from anything else? And again, I won't go into that question because it is just a tick box, as we've seen so often. Does your data protection policy describe how you keep personal data safe and secure? It shouldn't be too challenging for most of you. Does your organization's data protection policy describe how you identify and minimize risks to personal data? So I will just open this one up because this is one that I think is quite pertinent at the moment. This is about a data protection impact assessment. And for all existing processes, you don't need to worry about that. But if you change or introduce a new process, such as introducing digital social care records, etc., then you should be carrying out a data protection impact assessment to identify whether or not there is any risk to the personal data within that introduction of the new process. So it's not rocket science. It's simply a risk assessment in the same way that any of your risk assessments are carried out, but specifically focusing on the personal and confidential information that you've identified in your information asset register, and identifying if changing the process from one thing to another has introduced any additional risks, any new risks that you might need to put mitigation measures in place or elimination of that risk, etc. So what this question is actually asking is, have you got a policy in place that says, if we change a process or we introduce a new process, we would carry out a data protection impact assessment? So it's really just prompting you to be aware of the requirement to do that and the fact that you have included it in your data protection policy, etc. Timetable, which sets out how long you retain records for. That's simply your retention schedule. So for each piece of information that you hold that meets the criteria, how long are you going to keep it, as specified by the requirements? And there is a link there to a schedule if you don't know how long you should be keeping records, because once the purpose for which you hold that record is no longer required, you should be deleting the record unless there is some other legal reason as to why you need to keep it. And then the next couple of questions are related to that. So if your retention schedule states that you should now be getting rid of the data, how do you do that? If you use a third party to get rid of that, so if you use a shredding company or some other organization that destroys the records when you no longer require them, have you got a contract with them? And do you review that regularly to check that it meets the requirements of data protection? And if you do it yourself, so if you put it through the shredder or burn it or use whatever other method you use, such as a hammer on the hard drive of a computer. It's asking you to specify how you do that to ensure that the data is destroyed securely. So whatever your response is. So one or other of those questions is possibly not applicable, because if you always destroy the records yourself, then you won't be using an organization outside of your own service. So 142 should be not applicable, and then you should be describing how you go about that process in 143. If you only use an external organization, then the reverse is true. Then you would respond to 142 and put not applicable in 143. Does your organization have a list of suppliers that handle personal information? So what we're talking about here are things like payroll, HR, DBS, etc., etc. And are you aware of who handles personal and confidential information, what they deliver in relation to that information, and how to get hold of them and what their contact details are, etc. And then we can see that the next two questions are not mandatory, so we can ignore those. Moving on to the third section, data security. This is probably one of the easiest ones. The tricky question, the top 3 data cybersecurity risks in your organization, so you'll see is not mandatory, so you don't have to respond to that. However, 1312, you do need to respond to. How do you make sure paper records are safe? So that may not apply if you are a care home, but it may apply if you are a domiciliary care agency, but it's asking you to think about your processes for keeping any paper records safe when they're taken out of. So if you accompany someone to the hospital with a folder, or if you take notes to visit a client in their own home, etc., how do you make sure that paper records are safe? And that's simply a text box response in terms of whatever it is that you do. And again, the purpose behind that question is that by completing the question, it prompts you to think about what you do and how you do it and whether or not it's appropriate. 1313, physical controls in buildings. What that's asking is just things like window locks, door locks, filing cabinet locks, etc. How do you make sure that the physical aspects of your building prevent anyone who shouldn't be having access to personal data getting hold of it? Data breach questions, 511, 521, 611, 612, all of these, with the exception of 521, are mandatory. And if you haven't had a data breach, then you can respond with not applicable to those questions. But 611, it asks what arrangements you've got in place should there be a data breach. So it does require you to have a contingency plan in place. So should it happen, everyone knows what to do and how to do that. And there's 3 questions there that are not mandatory. Business continuity plan. So making the point that your business continuity plan, which most organizations will have, is asking you to include data and cybersecurity issues. So it makes the point about power cuts, phone line, internet, etc., being hacked. All of the sorts of issues you'll be aware of that are potential threats to cybersecurity and data security. And have you covered that in your business continuity plan? So should it happen, would people know what to do and how to do it? The next mandatory question, have you tested that business continuity plan? So it's all well and good having a business continuity plan on the shelf, but how do you actually check that the measures you've put in place would work and that people do know what to do, etc.? So it's asking you to specify how you go about that process. And then the last 2 questions are not mandatory. Moving on to the last section, IT systems and devices. If staff, directors, trustees and volunteers use their own devices, have you got a bring your own device policy that specifies what they should do, how they should do it, and hold them to account to follow that policy, etc. So if people are using their own mobile phones, tablets, laptops, etc. to access personal and confidential information, are you confident that that data is secure? What procedures have you got in place if mobile phones, laptops, etc. are lost, stolen, hacked or used inappropriately? How are you going to keep track of all of that, and how are you going to make sure that data is not compromised? Does your organization have a reliable way of removing or amending people's access to the systems when they leave or change roles? Particularly important where people might have been using their own devices and had access to the cloud data or other files or systems that you might be using. How do you make sure that you can prevent them continuing to have access to that, etc.? And then it goes on to ask about password practice, whether or not everyone is familiar with best practice around passwords, not using the same password for multiple things, not sharing passwords, and how to set strong passwords, etc. Making sure on 621 here, it's asking that you make sure that antivirus, anti-malware software is kept up to date, and that all of the systems that you use, all the computers and devices that are used in the organization are up to date with that. Particularly important in terms of antivirus to make sure that you've got the latest patches that are designed to pick up the newest threats, etc. Again, there's one there that's not mandatory, but moving on to 632, is everyone aware that using public Wi-Fi for work purposes is unsafe? So making sure as part of the training that people receive that they're familiar with the lack of security on public Wi-Fi systems. And then it talks about your backup processes. How do you back up your data? Do you back up to a hard disk? Do you back up to the cloud? Whatever is the process that you've identified in your business continuity planning, I would suggest is likely to be also spelt out here. Being able to access emergency contacts. Do you check your backups? So should something happen to your system, if you were hacked, if your system was subject to a ransomware attack or whatever, would you still have access to unencrypted data in order to be able to carry on business as usual, etc. So it's asking you all of the best cybersecurity practices, making sure that you do those. Is the software and other systems that you use supported by the manufacturer? Therefore, you get the updates, etc. Or if not, have you carried out a data security impact risk assessment to identify the risks and that you've managed those risks? And then 835. Linking with that, how does your organization make sure the latest software updates are downloaded and installed? Is it because it's automatic, such as Windows 10, Windows 11, where the updates, if you could switch it on, automatically install as you go through? Or is there a process in place to periodically update things manually? Whatever your organization does needs to be specified there to make sure that everything is up to date. And then 911, asking about passwords of network components such as your Wi-Fi router. So making sure that the password that is used on that is not the original one. When you first acquire a Wi-Fi router or other electronic device, quite often it has a default password, such as 12340000, etc. Have you made sure that that's changed to something that is only known by people within your organization. And then you can see there's a whole raft of questions that are not mandatory. Before we move to 952, which is asking about encryption. And encryption is about, encryption makes sure that any data that is encrypted cannot be read without the password to unencrypt it. And most devices these days that you buy have encryption built into them. You just need to enable it. Whether or not you need to encrypt data, I would suggest needs again to be part of your risk assessment process within your organization. However, it can be a really useful way of ensuring that, for example, should a laptop get lost, if the data is encrypted, no one's going to be able to access that information. Therefore, you can be assured that even if you don't get it back, the data is safe. And then lastly, the last mandatory question is asking about your organization's IT system suppliers and have they got cybersecurity certification? So whoever you use for your IT input, whether it's the gardener's son or whether it's an external company, it's about checking whether or not they understand about best practice in terms of cybersecurity and have they been certified. And most IT system suppliers that will be working with your systems, I would suggest, will be able to answer that question and will probably say yes. However, if it is the gardener's son, you may want to make sure that they have the correct understanding and knowledge around ensuring that your systems are perfectly safe, etc. So that's a quick work through some of the questions. And as I say, once all of the mandatory questions have got completed next to them, you're in a position to publish the assessment. And then it asks you to check. So I was talking about the profile earlier, and it will ask you to go through the various roles that I referred to, and the same questions that you were asked when you set your profile. If that's all still good, publish the assessment. And that's the screenshot that I showed you earlier on to show that your assessment has been published. And you can see just above view all publications, there is the link that says download a certificate to confirm DSPT compliance. And then you're done. And you can, I was going to say you can forget about DSPT for the next year, but in fact, you can't, because should something change, you will need to revisit it to update it. So, any questions, any thoughts